Reaching north from the English border, Scotland is a nation that is full of history. The Highland feuds and battles, great Celtic warriors and their clans. It is also a nation of great beauty. Wooded glens, valleys, mountains, and the deep, silent, and mysterious lochs lie scattered about this untamed country of the north. Bagpipes, the sound of Scotland, striking fear into the hearts of the warring clans and all those who opposed them. Their association with Scotland is legendary, but it was until recently an instrument played only in the Highlands. It was during the 16th century that bagpipe music became popular throughout Scotland, and during this century most towns would have employed a town piper. But with the collapse of the Highland clan system, following the Jacobite uprising of 1745, many of the traditional forms of Highland music disappeared altogether. Bagpipe music might have suffered a similar fate, but for the fact that it was adopted by the military. As well as the music, the occasion also provides an opportunity to admire the famous Scottish kilts. Like bagpipe music, the kilt also originated in the Highlands. Each clan had their own unique form of tartan by which they could be identified. The kilt did not filter down to the rest of Scotland until the 17th century. Prior to this, the Lowlanders were very scathing about the kilt, saying, "The common habit of the Highlander is far from being acceptable to the eye. Their dress is called the quelt, and for the most part they wear this petticoat so very short that on a windy day going up a hill or stooping, the indecency of it is plainly discovered." In about 700 BC, the first Celts began to arrive from Europe. 600 years later, the Romans invaded Britain, but never managed to conquer Scotland. It was during the Middle Ages, while Edward I was on the English throne, that some of Scotland's more famous historical events took place. On the death of the Scottish king and his heir, Edward of England took it upon himself to act as king of both England and Scotland. William Wallace, a common Highlander, waged war against the English, enjoying a great victory at Stirling Bridge. His role was adopted by another Scottish hero, Robert the Bruce. Bruce was a Scottish nobleman dissatisfied with the subservience of the Scottish nobles to the English and continued Wallace's harassment of the English. He was, in fact, very successful, capturing several castles before enjoying a glorious victory against the English at Bannockburn. Towards the middle of the 16th century, another famous Scottish figure was to ascend the throne, Mary, Queen of Scots. Despite her fame, Mary did not have the qualities to rule Scotland successfully, and she was finally executed by Elizabeth I. Throughout the 18th century, the rebellious Scottish spirit began to surface once again. This was to lead to the uprising of 1745. Led by Bonnie Prince Charlie, this was another attempt to gain Scottish independence, but this one was to have disastrous effects. The eventual outcome of the uprising was the complete devastation of the Highlanders. Many were murdered or shipped away to become slaves. Their castles were destroyed and their cattle were slaughtered in this brutal attempt to destroy the Highland clan system. Perched atop a cliff above the rocky shores of the Isle of Mull, there stands Duart Castle. In many ways, Stuart Castle is the archetypal Highland castle, with its history of clan warfare and its eventual destruction after the Jacobite uprising of 1745. Stuart has been the home of the Clan MacLean, a typical Highland clan since the 13th century. The MacLeans are sworn enemies of the Campbell clan, and the bitter feud between the two families is legendary. It started in 1668, when Lachlan MacLean married Catherine Campbell. When she failed to produce an heir, Lachlan abandoned her on an isolated rock to drown with the incoming tide. She was, in fact, rescued just in time, but the Campbells swore revenge. The Campbells stayed true to their word, and on a visit to Edinburgh, Lachlan MacLean was murdered in his bed. The two families have been enemies ever since. There was, however, one attempt to overcome the feud. Towards the beginning of this century, on his 100th birthday, Sir Fitzroy MacLean received a telegram from the Campbell chief of the time, suggesting they bury the hatchet. Sir Fitzroy replied, "Certainly, in my lifetime." Thus, the two families remain enemies to this day. Sir Fitzroy MacLean, 26th chief of the clan, visited the castle as a boy, while it was still just a ruined shell, and vowed to restore it to its former glory. In 1911, he finally achieved his ambition, and in the summer of 1912, held a huge gathering of the clan to celebrate the restoration of the castle. Sir Fitzroy's son, Lord MacLean, opened the castle to the public and to all the MacLean descendants who returned to the castle to discover their ancestry. On his deathbed, Sir Fitzroy MacLean requested that when his time came, he be buried facing the castle he loved. His family honoured his dying wishes. Standing in a lonely graveyard on the Isle of Mull shoreline is Sir Fitzroy's tombstone, staring out across the water at his beloved Duart Castle. Dating from the 14th century, this castle was the home of the Campbell clan, who had been at war with the MacLeans of Duart Castle for so long. It was Sir John Campbell's sister who married Lachlan MacLean, and Sir John who murdered Lachlan in revenge. According to legend, when the first Thane of Cawdor decided to build a castle, he took the advice of a holy man. He was instructed to load bags of gold onto the back of a donkey, and where the donkey lay down to rest, he was to build his castle. The donkey rested beneath a holly tree, a symbol of luck and prosperity, and Cawdor Castle was built around it. The actual tree remains in the castle today. Another unusual feature of the castle is its interior. The living room is filled with modern furniture. The walls hung with a combination of old family portraits. The reason behind this is that the castle is actually lived in for much of the year by Lady Cawdor, who still spends 6 months of the year here, and even sleeps in the huge 4-poster bed topped with curled ostrich feathers. These feathers are made by 2 old ladies in the Rue des Beaux-Arts in Paris. These ladies specialize in the art of curling ostrich feathers. They also curl them for the Folies Bergère. The tapestries hung on the walls are Flemish and were made to order in Flanders. Known as arras hangings, they were used not only for decoration, but for warmth too. They have hung on the walls since the 16th century, removed only occasionally to be cleaned. French furniture and beautiful French sculpture are scattered around the house, including this fine statuette in fired clay. To many people, this castle would be familiar as the home of the ill-fated Thane of Cawdor in Shakespeare's Macbeth. While Macbeth was only a fictitious story and had nothing to do with the actual castle itself, the story surrounding the beginnings of the castle is one Shakespeare himself would have been proud of. Abbotsford is the remarkable home of a truly remarkable man, Sir Walter Scott, the author of such works as Rob Roy and The Lady of the Lake. Abbotsford House was Scott's pride and joy, and as he achieved success through his writing, he lavished time and money on his beloved home. Today, rising above one of the most beautiful gardens in Scotland, it is almost a museum, filled with the many historical relics which Scott collected over the years. Scott surrounded himself with relics belonging to a time of Celtic warriors, clans, and heroes. In the main hall are 2 swords rescued from the Battle of Culloden in 1745, where Bonnie Prince Charlie was finally defeated by the English forces. On the mantelpiece sits a bronze model of the skull of Robert the Bruce, taken when his grave was dug up in 1815. There is even a piece of armor with a bullet hole from the Battle of Waterloo. Although the wealth of weaponry adorning the walls might suggest Scott's own family history to be that of a military background, the Scott clan had its last battle back at the beginning of the 16th century. When Scott was young, he was sent to his grandfather's to recover from a bad leg injury. It is generally considered that it was during this time recuperating, his imagination became full of tales of brutal Celtic battles, heroes, and feuds. This inspiration set the future tone of some of his most popular novels. In his study at Abbotsford, Scott would work from 5 in the morning until 9 at night. It was here he was to produce such fine works as the Waverley novels. However, his publishing company, in which he was a partner, ran into financial difficulties. Scott was determined to repay his debts. He is quoted as saying, "I will dig in the mine of my imagination to find diamonds to make good my indebtedness." In gratitude, the company donated their library to him. It is here he kept his most prized possessions. Rob Roy's purse, a crucifix Mary Queen of Scots took to her execution, a pocketbook owned by Flora MacDonald, and most precious of all, a lock of Bonnie Prince Charlie's hair. Scott's novels and his own integrity and character led him to be one of the best loved and most respected men in Scotland during his lifetime. Eventually, the pace proved too much for him, and on 21st of September 1832, he died. Were he to return to Abbotsford today, he would find very little has changed. Today, Abbotsford is still owned by the Scott family, lived in by his great-great-granddaughters. In the northeast of Scotland sits another magnificent Highland castle, Blair. This castle is the most visited in all of Scotland. Built in 1269, this almost fairy tale castle has been the home of the Dukes of Atholl of the Murray clan for over 700 years. Like most Highland castles, it had its own part to play in the Jacobite uprising of 1745. It actually holds the distinction of being the last castle in Britain to be besieged. It was held by government forces during the uprising and attacked by the rebel forces of Bonnie Prince Charlie. Its most remarkable feature is that it is home to the last private army in Britain, the Atholl Highlanders. The present Duke of Atholl is the last man in Britain allowed to maintain a private army, a privilege bestowed on a former Duke of Atholl by Queen Victoria during the 1900s. This military history is plainly visible. Hung on the gallery walls above is a magnificent display of weaponry, widely regarded as the best private collection of weapons in Britain. The Grand Salon is furnished with numerous historical pieces, most precious of which is the quaich, a form of punch bowl that is brought out twice a year to celebrate Scotch whisky. Mary Queen of Scots once stayed here for 3 weeks, and on one particular hunting trip, the party shot 5 wolves and 350 deer, the antlers of which adorn the corridors. Although the Queen might have enjoyed such pastimes as hunting, the ladies of the house were encouraged to enjoy more genteel pastimes. A piece of lace worked by Lady Evelyn Stuart Murray, daughter of the 7th Duke of Atholl, has been heralded as the finest piece of lace worked in Britain this century. Along the banks of the River Clyde lies the estate of New Lanark. It was David Dale and Richard Arkwright who decided to harness the natural power created by the Clyde Falls and use it to spin cotton. Despite the difficult access, it was to become the largest cotton manufacturing establishment in Scotland. Dale and Arkwright began building the factory in the 1780s, and the spinning actually started in March of 1786. Each mill workroom measured about 150 feet by 30 feet and contained machinery to drive hundreds of spindles. Up to 75 workers would work in such a room. New Lanark developed during the Industrial Revolution, and David Dale and later Robert Owen were to prove to their contemporaries that it was possible to run a profitable business without sacrificing the health and well-being of the factory workers, mostly children. While this was not unusual at the time, what was different was that they were housed, well-fed, and well-clothed. They would sleep 3 to a bed, the beds being made of wood with mattresses filled with straw, the straw being changed every month. They would have 2 outfits which would each be washed every 2 weeks, and their linens would be changed once a week. A savings bank and sickness fund were set up, and workers flocked to the village as the community grew. Robert Owen would buy food wholesale and sell it to the factory workers at a little over cost price. The small profit that was made from this was immediately put back into the community. New Lanark has been credited with the beginnings of today's laws with respect to employees, and even with the birth of socialism itself. New Lanark today is still very much a thriving community. Although much of it has now been turned into luxury apartments, and the residents are no longer factory workers, the cotton mill itself is still a functioning mill and the major focal point in New Lanark's proud history. The rivers and streams of Scotland were harnessed not only to drive cotton mills, they were used to make flour as well. Wheat was virtually impossible to cultivate in Scotland up until the 18th century. This was because most of the land suitable for wheat was occupied by oats and rye, commonly referred to as weeds. These were the main ingredients of the Scottish diet before the arrival of wheat. A mill such as this would have been seen in the 18th century. The basics of making flour involve removing the shell of the wheat kernel from the fleshy inside. This was a relatively slow process, as the grains had to be fed through in limited amounts. In modern milling, wheat kernels are cleaned and tempered by the addition or removal of moisture and then split open. In the first flour mills, natural aging would dry out the grain and bleach it, ready to be ground. With the arrival of wheat, Scotland saw the appearance of bakeries. Virtually all the bread eaten in Scotland at this time would have been produced by them, hardly any being home-produced. It wasn't until the late 19th century, with the general introduction of the domestic oven, that Scots women had the opportunity to try their hand at baking. The The rivers of Scotland are home to a very popular Scottish inhabitant. The salmon, regarded as a delicacy throughout the world today, was so common in the 18th century that Scottish servants refused to eat it more than twice a week. Salmon fishing is an old tradition, although the methods of catching them have changed over the years. Today, game fishers may use spinning gear and artificial lures, but the traditional technique of fly fishing requires more skill, technique, and of course, a license. Scotland is famous for other fine foods, such as game meats and haggis. Haggis is a traditional Scottish food that contains sheep's heart, liver, and lungs, all wrapped and cooked in the sheep's stomach. Scotland is now also famous for oysters. Loch Fyne is one of the few lakes in Britain which has the Grade A water needed to farm shellfish. This is no doubt helped by the lack of industry in the area and a considerable amount of rain. Oysters have always been native here. In 1978, John Noble and Andrew Lane saw the opportunity to start farming them, and now more than 2 million oysters are farmed at Loch Fyne. As the oysters grow big enough to eat, they are brought closer to the shore. Here they are subject to the tide going in and out, and as it does, the oysters open and close their shells, thus strengthening their muscles. It is this action that ensures they are of a good quality. Visitors can stop at the Loch Fyne Oyster Bar and enjoy a plate of seafood while admiring the spectacular view across the lake. Surely one of the finest pieces of Scottish heritage is malt whisky. The Glenfiddich distillery was built by William Grant over 100 years ago. Grant was obviously a man of great foresight and ambition, as he was willing to wait over 20 years to realize his dream of producing the best dram in the valley. Today, Glenfiddich is a household name. But despite its worldwide fame, it is made using exactly the same time-honored methods as it always has. There are 3 main ingredients in whiskey: malted barley, yeast, and water. It is in the latter that the secret of the unique quality of Glenfiddich lies. Glenfiddich is the only distillery that uses the same water in all the production processes: distilling, maturing, and bottling, as well as using it as an ingredient. The water itself is also unique. It is soft Highland spring water taken from the Robbie Dhu. In the process of whiskey making, this water is first heated and mixed with the malted barley. The heat of the water dissolves the sugars from the barley, producing a substance known as wort. Once the wort is cooled, the yeast is added and the fermentation begins. This takes place in the traditional wooden washbacks, as a biological reaction occurs between the wood and the wort, which does not occur with stainless steel washbacks. Next comes distillation, and this is still done over the old copper pot stills. These copper pot stills are heated by furnaces tended to by the factory's coppersmith. When William Grant first purchased copper stills, they were only second-hand and therefore a little battered and dented. Today, those dents are copied exactly when new ones are made, in case they should affect the flavor of the whiskey. After the distillation, the spirit passes through into the spirit safes, where the middle cut is selected. Only the purest spirit, known as the heart of the distillation, goes on to be matured. This spirit is then diluted slightly, using the same Robidoux spring water as in all the other processes, and is then finally passed into wooden casks, where it is left to mature for at least 8 years. While the spirit lies in these casks, it obtains a caramel color from the wood. This is entirely natural, and no colorants are used to produce this shade. Once matured, the whiskey is bottled and then shipped off to destinations across the world. It was in December of 1887 that the first whiskey ran from the stills. Over 100 years later, the business is still a family business, and the whiskey produced is as fine as it ever was. Edinburgh, officially declared Scotland's capital city by James III in 1460, has long since inspired poets and authors. Its magnificent castle in the center of the city towers over the medieval streets of the Old Town and the grand Georgian architecture of the New. The castle's resemblance to the Acropolis in Athens has given rise to Edinburgh being known as the Athens of the North. The castle itself dates from the 12th century. However, a fortification has stood on this site for more than 1,000 years. Around that time, the castle was considered to be virtually impenetrable. However, in 1313, a young servant working in the castle led Robert the Bruce and his men up the side of the rock and into the castle walls, where he defeated the English garrisons and captured it. As one of the most significant attractions in Scotland, it commands breathtaking panoramic views of the city beneath it. Edinburgh is divided into two main sections, the Old Town and the New Town. The main street in the Old Town is the Royal Mile, which extends from the castle for a mile down to Holyrood Palace. During the Middle Ages, for purposes of defence, Edinburgh was a walled town. This meant that within the castle walls there was not much space, and so taller buildings had to be built to fit more people in. An example of this can be seen in James Court. Many a distinguished visitor would have passed through James Court. Robert Louis Stevenson, Robert Burns, and Sir Walter Scott would all have passed through at one time or another. Once a year, there is a cultural explosion in Edinburgh. This is the Edinburgh Festival. Held every summer, this began originally in 1947 as no more than a small theatre festival. It gradually expanded, and today is an enormous event comprising a jazz festival, a comedy festival, book festival, and a television festival. People travel from all over the world to join the Scottish celebrations. Just beyond the northern boundaries of the new town are the Royal Botanic Gardens. Although these now cover about 80 acres, they grew from no more than a small garden of medicinal herbs. They were originally begun by Sir Robert Sibbald in 1661. Sibbald was one of the founders of the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh and the university's first professor of medicine. He developed the small physic garden from which today's garden developed. The site has moved several times since, the present site dating back to the 1820s. The gardens are both peaceful and beautiful. Edinburgh's legendary rival and the industrial capital of Scotland is Glasgow. The splendour of George Square in the centre of Glasgow does not remind one of the fact that it was once one of the biggest shipbuilding centres in the world. Not far from George Square, under the watchful eye of Sir Walter Scott, lies a very different Glasgow to the one he would have remembered. Saucyhall Street is a popular pedestrian shopping area in the city centre, which has been going through a stage of rebirth recently. This is shown in no better way than by Prince's Square. This lavish shopping mall was built on a site that was once old tenement blocks and run-down housing estates. Now it is packed with the young and affluent citizens of Glasgow, who are said to spend more money on designer clothes than any other young people in Britain. It is commonly said that it is the people of Glasgow who give the place its friendly ambience. There are a mixture of Highlanders, Lowlanders, and Irish, and this certainly lends a vibrant feel to the city. An area of Glasgow known as the West End is filled with a multitude of fine 19th century terraced houses. The most impressive of all has to be the Glasgow School of Art. Built in 1896 by Charles Rennie Mackintosh, this is one of the oldest and most renowned art schools in Europe. Mackintosh was actually a student at the previous art school when a competition was held to choose a student to build the new art school. Mackintosh won, and the Glasgow School of Art is the result, heralded as one of the greatest examples of his work. No detail has been overlooked. Every lampshade, chair, and window received the architect's careful attention. Mackintosh really caused a style revolution when he applied his Art Nouveau style to his furniture designs. Combining lines of natural forms and pastel colors with the straight, clean lines of modernism. The entire appearance of the school seems very modern, even by today's standards. Another fine example of Mackintosh's work can be seen in the Willow Tea Rooms on Saucyhall Street. Saucyhall actually means Street of the Willows, and with respect to this, Mackintosh developed an abstract willow design which he used on the windows and leaded friezes throughout the tea rooms. The tea rooms were particularly popular during the 1920s and 30s as the place to be seen, but in the following years its popularity dropped somewhat. Now, once again, the tea rooms are as popular as they were in the 20s and 30s, demonstrating the insight and endurance of the unique Mackintosh style. Lying in a cluster off the northwest coast of Scotland are the Hebrides. Extending up the coast to the Highland shores, the character of the highlands and the islands are often felt to be similar and are often uttered in the same breath. Across the misty waters from the Isle of Mull and the isolated splendour of such romantic sites as Duart Castle lies the town of Oban. At one time a small fishing village, its only contact with the mainland was by ferry. Now called the Caledonian MacBrayne, it served 23 islands for over 140 years, carrying not just people, but vital supplies such as clothes and food. Herring fishermen still trawl the fruitful waters as they have done over the centuries, but nowadays Oban has become a very popular seaside resort during the summer months. Although the town itself, rising up from the rocky Hebridean shorelines, has a population of only 7,000 people, it is by far the largest port in northwest Scotland. The islands are as wild and windswept as the great highlands themselves. Swathed in sea mists, the rugged heather-covered peaks sit beneath a fringe of swirling highland cloud. The desolate beauty of battlements, ravaged over the centuries by wars and the forces of nature. Romantic images, as remote as they are poignant reminders of a history filled with clans and conflicts. A never-ending wilderness where only the ghost of a Highland warrior might stir. The only sound, that of the lonely echo of the wind. Lying at the base of a steep, wooded highland valley lies Loch Ness. Nicknamed Scotland's Jurassic Lake, it is 24 miles long and 700 feet deep. The amount of peat in the water is so dense that at only 40 feet there is complete darkness. What better home for Scotland's most notorious inhabitant, the Loch Ness Monster? The loch has been the subject of global interest and investigation for over 60 years. There have been a number of so-called sightings since 1933, when the motorway that runs alongside the loch was built. The Loch Ness Investigation Bureau was set up to trace the monster, but has up till now been confounded by the depth and darkness of the water. Standing on the shores of the loch is the brooding figure of Urquhart Castle. Once one of the largest fortifications in the whole of Scotland, it now stands as a silent witness to whatever might be lurking in the deep. The Scottish people remain fiercely proud of their unique heritage, which is still widely upheld. The Highland fling is still danced with spirit and grace, and the kilt proudly worn at every opportunity. Scotland is a country steeped in tradition, from the sculptured gardens of the stately homes to the brutal beauty of the Highlands. The haunting sound of pipes echoes through the hills over grand and mysterious castles, where a timeless beauty and majesty prevails.